They said she didn't belong here. That's what the colonel muttered under his breath as she walked into the briefing room for the first time. Boots silent, jacket zipped high, eyes locked on the table stacked with intel packets no one thought she'd earned the right to read. 28 years old, Avery Hale looked younger than most of the cadets seated in that room, and younger still to the veterans who'd spent decades carving scars into their shoulders and their memories. She heard the whispers. She always did. Civilian. Desk jockey. Recruiter's mistake. Words meant to be quiet, but sharpened enough to cut when they landed. She never answered, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she had learned a long time ago that silence was heavier than any defense you could speak out loud. But on this day, this ordinary gray morning at Fort Ironclad, her silence would change everything. Before we go further, if you believe respect must be earned, not given, make sure to like and subscribe right now. Because when this moment comes, when the SEAL stands and speaks 5 words that freeze the entire room, you're going to want to remember exactly where you were when you heard it. The air in the room carried that familiar weight, the kind you only feel in places where pride walks louder than footsteps. Officers leaned against polished oak chairs. Cadets scrolled through notes they barely understood. And in the center of it all, Commander Briggs cleared his throat over the low hum of side chatter. "This," he said, pointing to the projected map of the Eastern Corridor, "is the operational plan for Horizon Vale. Joint Task Force. We've got drone coverage, thermal scans, everything." His voice was steady, confident, but it didn't hide the fact that for 3 weeks, they'd been circling the same unsolved problem, Sector Crimson. That's where Avery's eyes were locked. The red perimeter blinked faintly on the projection, a small wedge of terrain between 2 ridgelines that Intel had labeled unverified threat, meaning they didn't know what was out there and didn't want to admit it. She knew why. She'd seen the drone footage. The timestamps didn't match. Contractor Hale. A voice cut through the silence. Lieutenant Trent Kessler. Young, decorated, and as loud as he was confident. He leaned back in his chair with the kind of casual arrogance that always got people laughing, even when the joke wasn't funny. "You see something out there the rest of us missed?" Avery didn't look up. "I'm reviewing the thermal signatures," she said, quiet, even. Kessler grinned, glancing around at the room for an audience before he spoke again. "Of course you are. I just figured you'd be more comfortable doing whatever it is civilians do. TikToks, spreadsheets, I don't know." A few muffled laughs. Someone coughed to hide one. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Across the room, seated near the far wall, an older man hadn't moved. He wasn't in uniform, but you didn't need one to know exactly what he was. Shoulders squared, jaw sharp, his gaze steady as if he'd been carved from the same stone as the walls behind him. Retired Navy SEAL Chief Warrant Officer Ryder Kane, though no one in the room called him by rank anymore. Most just called him the old man. He wasn't laughing. In the corner of Avery's jacket sleeve, stitched so small you could miss it if you weren't looking, a crimson arrow caught a sliver of light from the projector. Barely visible. Barely there. But Ryder saw it. His gaze lingered, unblinking, before shifting back to the map. The briefing went on, every voice except Avery's filling the space. Officers traded jargon. Cadets asked nervous questions meant to sound smart. And through it all, Avery's silence stayed anchored, steady, deliberate. She wasn't here to prove herself. She wasn't here to win them over. She was here because the perimeter was wrong, and they were about to walk straight into something none of them were prepared for. She waited, always waited, until Kessler tried again. "So," he said, tapping the map where the crimson zone pulsed faintly, "I guess our contractor here has some kind of theory about ghosts in the trees? Or are we just padding budgets at this point?" More laughter. The kind that spreads quickly because no one wants to be the one who doesn't join in. This time Avery did look up, slowly, her gaze sharp but calm. "The timestamps don't line up," she said evenly. "Your drone data says the corridor's cold. My intercept says there were 3 unauthorized heat signatures in that same stretch at 0200 hours. Somebody's moving out there." The room went quiet for a beat, just long enough for Kessler to smirk. "Cute theory," he said. "But I'll trust the guys who've actually done this before." And that's when Ryder Kane finally moved. It wasn't loud. He didn't slam a hand on the table, or clear his throat, or raise his voice. He simply shifted forward in his chair, planted both boots on the ground, and stood. Slowly, deliberately, A presence heavy enough to draw every pair of eyes without a sound spoken. Avery froze. So did Kessler. So did Briggs. The room didn't know what was about to happen. Ryder looked straight at Avery, his voice low but carrying clear enough to reach the back wall. "Crimson Arrow," he said, each syllable sharp, deliberate, measured like a command that belonged to another lifetime. Front and center. The chatter stopped instantly. A single heartbeat of silence. Avery's expression didn't change, but her hands curled slightly into fists beneath the table. No one else in the room knew what that meant, but Ryder Kane did. So did anyone who had ever worn the insignia stitched quietly beneath her sleeve. That was no patch. That was a calling sign. And suddenly, the story the entire room thought they were living in, the one where Avery Hale was the outsider, the tag-along, the civilian who didn't belong, was no longer the story at all. The next chapter had already started. They just didn't know it yet. For a second, no one moved. Not the officers lined along the far wall. Not the cadets gripping their tablets a little too tightly. Not even Kessler, who'd been halfway through another sarcastic remark before Ryder Kane's voice cut through the oxygen in the room. Crimson Arrow, front and center. 5 words. That's all it took. Avery Hale hesitated, not out of fear, but because it had been years since anyone had spoken that call sign aloud. She rose slowly, boots soft against the polished floor, her chair scraping just enough to echo through the silence like a bell in an empty chapel. Kessler leaned back, trying to mask his confusion with a smirk. "What is this? Some kind of code?" he muttered under his breath, but no one laughed this time. Not a sound. Ryder Kane's eyes never left hers. His face was unreadable, carved from stone and memory, but there was something burning just beneath it. Recognition. Wait. History. Commander Briggs shifted uncomfortably at the head of the table. "Chief Kane, what exactly?" Ryder lifted a single hand, silencing him without a word. And for reasons Briggs couldn't explain, he stopped talking. Everyone did. Avery stopped 2 feet from Ryder, her posture controlled, precise, but the subtle tension in her shoulders betrayed the storm beneath her composure. Kane studied her for a long, quiet moment before finally speaking, his voice steady, but roughened by something heavier than authority. "You were there," he said softly. "Weren't you?" Avery's throat tightened, but she nodded once. 5 years ago, she answered. Korvac Ridge. The name landed like a dropped grenade no one saw coming. A low murmur rippled through the room. Someone near the back whispered the words under their breath. Korvac Ridge. And suddenly, even the cadets who had barely been paying attention leaned forward, eyes sharp. Everyone here knew the story. Everyone had heard rumors about the failed extraction in enemy-held territory that went black for 36 hours. Most believed the official report: communication failure, aborted mission, 0 casualties. But what no one outside of classified clearance knew was what really happened out there. Ryder knew, and now, apparently, so did Avery. He stepped aside just enough to reach into the worn leather satchel at his side. When his hand emerged, he placed a sealed operations file on the table. Dark gray, stamped with 3 faded letters no one dared ignore. Redacted. He slid it forward. "This isn't supposed to exist," he said, his tone clipped and controlled, but the weight behind it trembled with memory. "But I kept my copy. And now you're all going to hear something that was never meant to leave that ridge." The room was silent. Even Kessler's smirk had dissolved, replaced by something closer to unease. Ryder opened the folder carefully, his calloused fingers tracing faded edges like he was unfolding ghosts. Inside were blurred photos, shredded maps, and one operations log, stamped in red, dated 5 years back. "Operation Crimson Arrow," he said, his voice low, almost reverent now. "A covert recon and rescue mission. 6-man SEAL unit. High-value extraction. 0 margin for error." He paused, letting the words settle like dust into every corner of the room. "We were trapped," he continued. "Pinned down. Radio silence across 3 channels. No support, no backup, no exit plan. We were surrounded in a kill box, and command wrote us off before the sun went down. 36 hours in hostile territory, the kind of hostile where you don't get a second chance to breathe." He let the silence stretch until it almost hurt to hold it. Then his gaze shifted, locking back on Avery. And then, Ryder said slowly, deliberately, she showed up. Every head in the room turned toward her. Kessler frowned, arms folded. "Wait her." A civilian intel analyst was sent into an active extraction op. Ryder's jaw tightened, the faintest flicker of irritation breaking through his composure. No, he said flatly. She wasn't sent. She wasn't even supposed to be there. He tapped the operations lock. She rerouted herself into the field, against protocol, against direct orders, because she decoded an enemy intercept no one else could read. She saw what was about to happen before any of us did, and she came anyway. Ryder paused, his voice steady but heavy. You're breathing right now, Lieutenant Kessler, because someone like her once walked straight into hell, so 6 men like me didn't die on that ridge. The tension in the room thickened, pressing against the walls until it felt suffocating. Commander Briggs cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Kane, classified or not, that doesn't explain. It explains everything, sir, Ryder cut in sharply, his voice carrying a steel edge that silenced even Briggs. He turned back to Avery, softer now. You didn't tell them. Avery's gaze lowered slightly. Wasn't my story to tell, she said quietly. It was the first time her voice broke, just barely, but enough for Ryder to notice. She'd carried this weight for years. The silence, the dismissal, the endless sideways glances in rooms like this one. All while knowing there were 6 men out there who still breathed because she hadn't waited for permission to act. And every time someone like Kessler called her civilian, she let them. Every time someone doubted her, she didn't fight back. Every time she was told she didn't belong here, she swallowed it down. Until now. Kessler shifted uncomfortably, his voice faltering when he finally spoke. You expect us to just believe all this? Ryder didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the folder again and pulled out a single laminated document, an official commendation, signed in bold black ink at the bottom. He laid it on the table, sliding it across until it rested right in front of Kessler. Read the signature, Ryder said. Kessler hesitated, then leaned forward, his brows furrowing as he traced the name aloud. General Isaac Langston. The room shifted instantly. Everyone in this building knew the name. Langston wasn't just a general, he was the general. The one who'd commanded Joint Special Operations for nearly 2 decades, whose word carried weight far beyond this base. The commendation wasn't ceremonial. It was a field-level directive of highest distinction, and in bold letters across the top, just beneath the seal, was a name no one had expected to see. Hale, Avery, Civilian Liaison, Unregistered. The title was almost meaningless next to the line beneath it, written in Langston's unmistakable script. For actions above and beyond the scope of mission authority, resulting in the survival of all 6 operatives under my command. Future classified status requested. Crimson Arrow. The last 2 words landed like thunder. Ryder straightened slowly, turning to face the stunned room. His voice carried the weight of command without needing the rank. You laughed at her, he said quietly, each word cutting sharp and clean. You doubted her. You dismissed her because she didn't wear the same uniform. But when the choice came down to who lives and who dies, none of us wore rank that day. We just followed the one person who could still see a way out. Avery stood still, silent, her gaze fixed on the map where Sector Crimson still blinked faintly in red. The weight of everything unspoken settled like a fog over the room. The cadets who had whispered about her earlier now sat straighter, their eyes wide and quiet. Even Kessler, face pale and jaw tight, said nothing. For the first time since the briefing began, no one questioned why she was there. Because now they understood. They hadn't invited her into this room. They were standing in hers. And Ryder Kane had just reminded them of that fact in front of every last one of them. But the storm wasn't over yet. Because what Ryder hadn't said, what the classified file didn't reveal, was why Avery Hale had disappeared after Korvac Ridge, and why her call sign hadn't been spoken in 5 years. That secret was coming. And when it arrived, the entire base would never be the same. The silence in the room wasn't just heavy now. It was suffocating. 1,000 unsaid things hung between Avery Hale and the officers who, just 20 minutes earlier, had dismissed her as a background extra in their story. But Avery still hadn't spoken. Her hands rested calmly at her sides, steady, still, as though every rumor, every laugh, every sideways glance they'd ever thrown at her had slid right off her shoulders. But the truth was heavier than any of them knew. And Ryder Kane, he wasn't finished. He closed the classified file carefully, his thumb lingering against the worn edges before setting it aside on the table. His voice, when it came, was low, deliberate, and almost personal. "They never put it in the report," Ryder said, his gaze locked on Avery now. "Not the part about the extraction. Not the part about you." Kessler shifted in his seat, still pale, still trying to find something sharp enough to claw back control of the room. But the silence around him made him smaller than he'd ever looked. "What do you mean?" Commander Briggs finally asked, his voice cautious, quieter than before. Ryder's jaw tightened. "I mean, she wasn't just the analyst who cracked the intercepts. She wasn't just the one who guided us out. She led the extraction team herself." The words landed like a hammer. Briggs blinked, stunned. "That's impossible. A civilian." Ryder shook his head once, cutting him off. "She wasn't supposed to be there." But when comms went dark and the evac point collapsed, Avery Hale made a decision command wouldn't. She crossed 2 kilometers of hostile terrain with nothing but a sidearm and a tracker, found 6 men bleeding in the mud, and walked us through a corridor no one else could see. He paused, glancing toward the blinking projection of Sector Crimson, his voice softening, like memory was catching him off guard. "I remember every second of it. The smell of cordite, the rain soaking through my rifle grip, the sound of enemy rounds hitting shields 6 inches from my head. I thought we were finished." He turned back to Avery, his voice steady again. "And then I heard her voice on the comms. Calm, unshaken, not giving us orders, giving us auctions. There's a difference." Avery's jaw flexed once, but she didn't speak. Her eyes stayed on Ryder's, unreadable. Kessler finally found his voice, though it cracked when he used it. "If she did all that, why isn't she in the report? Why doesn't anyone know?" That's when Ryder's expression shifted. The faintest flicker of something darker crossed his face. "She signed it away," he said quietly. "They offered her a medal. She refused. They offered her clearance and rank. She walked." The cadets exchanged confused glances. The officers murmured under their breath. Even Briggs leaned forward now, eyes narrowed in disbelief. "Why?" someone finally asked from the back. For the first time since the briefing began, Avery spoke, softly, like her voice had been waiting for this exact moment. "Because the mission didn't end when we got out." The room froze again. Her gaze swept slowly across the table, locking onto the map, the red blinking edge of Sector Crimson pulsing faintly in the silence. "They called it a rescue op," she continued quietly. "But it wasn't. There was a second team inside those hills, deep recon, off books. They didn't make it out. Command buried the failure to protect political optics, scrubbed the records clean, and called Korvac Ridge a success." Her hands, steady until now, tightened slightly at her sides. "I didn't take a medal for something we left unfinished." For a long moment, no one breathed. Ryder lowered his gaze, almost reverently, like he was standing back inside that night again. "Crimson Arrow wasn't just a mission name," he said. "It was a promise." Commander Briggs cleared his throat softly, his voice thinner now. "And you?" He hesitated, almost reluctant to finish the question. "You kept it." Avery's answer came without hesitation. Every day, the weight of those 2 words settled like steel across the room. For the first time, the cadets sitting along the far wall saw her differently. Not as the quiet contractor with no rank, no insignia, no seat at their table, but as someone who had walked through fire they'd only ever read about. Someone who had kept walking. But Kessler wasn't done yet. He wanted one last piece of control, one last chance to hold on to the hierarchy that had just collapsed under him. "So what now?" he said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to him. "We're supposed to salute her or something?" And that's when Ryder Kane stepped forward, boots striking once against the polished floor, and came to full attention. He turned sharply, facing Avery, and without a word, his right hand rose in one clean, precise motion. A salute. Not casual, not polite, perfect, flawless, the kind reserved for commanding officers and legends. The entire room went silent. Commander Briggs rose next, slowly at first, but deliberately, his palm flattening at his temple as his eyes locked on Avery. Then, one by one, cadets stood from their seats. Officers followed. Even Kessler, jaw tight and pale, rose last, his hands stiff, his pride cracked in half, but still intact enough to understand the moment. Dozens of salutes. A wall of them, for the woman they'd dismissed as an outsider. Avery didn't move for a long moment. Her shoulders lifted slightly, a breath she'd been holding for 5 years breaking loose. Finally, she returned the salute, small, measured, quiet. No words. None were needed. And then Ryder spoke, his voice low, steady, almost reverent. "This," he said, gesturing toward Avery, "is why you don't measure worth by rank. We're uniforms. We're titles. You measure it by what someone's willing to risk when no one's watching." The silence that followed wasn't awkward anymore. It was respect. Heavy, earned, unshakable. Ryder Kane closed the classified file one last time, sliding it toward Commander Briggs without another word. The red perimeter on the map still blinked faintly. Sector Crimson, the next battlefield. But now, the room looked at Avery differently. Not as an outsider. As the one who had already walked through fire and returned carrying ghosts they'd never know. Ryder's gaze met hers once more. He gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable, but she understood it completely. 5 years ago, she'd saved his life. Today, he'd given her back her name, Crimson Arrow, and from that day forward, no one at Fort Ironclad ever forgot it.